Hello, Father Fred here. Good to be with you again. You know, a lot of us have gone through changes in the past year or so with COVID-19 and a lot of problems in the world and in our country that we're dealing with. In other words, you've had changes in your circumstances, in your work, in your play, and in your life because of this pandemic. And I'd like to talk about the kind of transformation that we can achieve through changing circumstances and come out fine on the other side. And discussing that, I want to cover the physical circumstance and change as related to the spiritual circumstance and change and transformation. And whenever I think about this subject, I go back to an Old Testament prophet who not real popular in his own time, and the book in the Old Testament about Jeremiah is often sometimes ridiculed by people that don't like his attitude about complain. He complains a lot, and but he offers us some solutions on the other side of his complaints that are I think, profound and transforming. You know, Jeremiah was a prophet of the end of the Israeli nation. The Israeli nation was formed by David back around 3,000 years ago. And his son Solomon consolidated the tribes and built a big temple. Well, that temple was still there 400 years later in 600 BC. That's 2,600 years ago. The temple was still there, but it was being assailed by the Babylonians. The Babylonians would come in and control Israel. And they would exact a recompense in the form of gold and valuables from Israel. And then they would leave for a while, and then they'd come back to get more money to buy, so they could buy their peace. But finally, around 600 BC, Israel was running out of money. The Babylonians had exacted too many tolls on them. So the Babylonians decided, well, why not just take the educated intellectuals that run the country here in Israel, and we'll transport them to Babylon. They can run our country, but as slaves. We don't even have to pay them. And so that's what they did. Well, in the meantime, you had the prophet Jeremiah warning the people of what the Babylonians were after and what was going to happen. He said, you're going to be taken into slavery to Babylon, and you'll be slaves. Well, people didn't like to hear this, especially the royal family hated this bad news from Jeremiah, the prophet of Israel at that time. And so, guess what they did? They had some thugs gathering up one night, and they threw him into a fairly deep well. Now, this well had been dug years before and had run out of water, or so they thought. And so they threw Jeremiah into it thinking that would kill him, and they'd get rid of this bad news guy that was bothering them to no end. Well, good luck happened for Jeremiah that night. At the bottom of the well, there was thick mud. And when he landed in that, he was bruised, but he was not killed. And his family and friends came and got him out of that well, and he kept preaching the bad news to the king. That did not deter him. But he was well protected by his family and friends after that. Well, the inevitable happened, and the Babylonian army came in, and they not only conquered Israel for the final time, but they also tore down the temple that had been built by Solomon 400 years before. And so Israel was in ruins. All the people that could read and write and run the government were taken to Babylon. The majority of the people fled. In fact, Alexandria, Egypt ended up having a larger Jewish population than had ever been in Israel. That's where the majority of the Jewish diaspora ended up, in Alexandria. Well, let's talk about a little more about Jeremiah. Jeremiah preached that Israel would be taken into slavery, and that it could last maybe several generations. But he also preached some good news. The good news is that Israel would keep their spiritual foundation together in slavery, that they would still adhere to the biblical principles that had been established for many hundreds of years that governed Judaism. They wouldn't have a temple, but they would be able to worship together in secret while in Babylon, and they would become strong in their spiritual knowledge, and they would pass it on to the younger generation intact. So here we had the juxtaposition of physical slavery of these people who were proud, and the spiritual regeneration that could occur while they were in slavery. Now, why is that important for us today? It's extremely important for us today because many people, not only in our own country but in the world, feel the pressures of the modern technological revolution, losing their jobs and having trouble adjusting to these new ways, these new technologies. This is very disruptive for our society and for the world. Now, we could succumb to this feeling of helplessness and succumb and give up and say, it's more than we can stand, it's more than we can deal with, and just turn off and lose our innovative curiosity and lose our spiritual foundation. But I believe that we have enough spiritual foundation that we can overcome these changes and we can be transformed in a new way. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next few weeks, how we can respond to changes like pandemics, even wars of the past. How can we respond to the technological revolution and the changing circumstances from that? How do we respond to death of family members and friends? To catastrophic events that are occurring more frequently in our world, like fires, like the sea is rising, the ice is melting at the poles. How can we respond to these things, these disruptions and catastrophic events, floods, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever? How can we respond to life-threatening injuries, diseases, problems where we work, and many other occurrences that happen regularly now in our world. I can think we can respond the way Jeremiah did, and he gave us a great gift in pointing out in a period of very, very tough circumstances for Israel and for their people, that spiritual awareness of these changes can lead to transformation and new ways of dealing with the world and with our changed circumstances. Remember what Jeremiah is saying. He says, while you are captives in Babylon, you can remain spiritually alive. Well, what about Jeremiah? What do y'all think about Jeremiah?
What I like about Jeremiah is
Jeremiah was a bullfrog, very good friend of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but I helped him to drink his wine. Yes, he always had some mighty fine wine, singing joy to the world, to all the boys and girls now. Joy to the fishes in the deep blue sea. Joy to you and me. Joy to the world. All the boys and girls now. Joy to the fishes in the deep blue sea. Joy to you and me.
Hey, one more time.